Matthew chapter 16 is a unique section of Scripture. It comes at a period of time in the ministry of Jesus when many of his miracles have already been performed. He's chosen his 12 apostles, and now he must prepare them for the big, grand battle that will be fought, the battle over the souls of men. And he's already given them special assignments within this wonderful kingdom, but they still don't understand some very important lessons. And in these few chapters that come in the midst of Matthew's writings, we're going to see a trip that he carries them on. Now, Jesus has just spent an extraordinary period of time in Matthew 16 and 15 in the regions around Galilee. And around that sea, he has healed hundreds, if not thousands of people. He makes his way to the opposite side of the sea, and then it says he takes the 12 and he begins to move north. And there's a reason for this. This is a very special time in his ministry. It's only weeks away that he'll be traveling back down to Jerusalem. He'll there encounter the Jewish leaders. He'll be crucified and he'll be resurrected. Of course, the disciples don't understand all of this. Even though he's been telling them these truths over and over again, they still don't get it. And so they have to have some extra lesson, some extra measure of faith-boosting experience that will help them and prepare them for what's coming. And so here's the question. How do you get them ready? How do you make them understand the enemy? How do you make them understand who they are and who you are as Messiah and the nature of your work and the nature of your kingdom? How do you do that? Well, if his intent had been to battle the Romans like most of them had expected, then you would have taken them to Rome and introduced them to that enemy. But if you're Jesus, and if the battle is against sin and Satan and spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places, you take them to Caesarea Philippi. You take them to the gates of hell. And that's what happens here in Matthew chapter 16 and 17. Caesarea was an interesting place. It's set up 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It was a place of lush green trees and vegetation, lots of water. It's the kind of place that kings love to go to. It was a mountain retreat. It's set right at the foot of Mount Hermon, in fact. And it was known as one of the fountainheads of the Jordan River. And so as Jesus and his disciples left Galilee, withdraw themselves and quietly make their way north, they're on a journey up the Jordan River to its very beginnings, to its source. And they're traveling to a place that has a reputation. This is the furthest north Jesus will ever travel in his ministry that we're aware of. This trip will mark not only the only trip north to this place that he has made, but very likely the only time any of the apostles had ever been to this place. You see, Caesarea had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. All of the rabbis in Jerusalem would tell a good Jew, you don't ever go there. It was the sin capital of their day. It was a place that was avoided, much like the region of Samaria was avoided. Its history ran all the way back into 900, 1000 BC, when Jeroboam in the divided kingdom had set up a place of worship for one of his gods, the golden calf that he erected, telling the children of Israel that were under his rule and reign that instead of going to Jerusalem, they could just worship here. And so he set up a temple for them. After that came the gods of Baal and their wicked, wicked worship of their king, their god. They would offer human sacrifices, killing their own babies on the altar to that vicious god. And then around 300 BC or so, we see it turn into a pagan capital. It becomes a center of worship for some of the Greek gods that were thought to rule the underworld, and gods that ruled the sky and the thunder, gods like Zeus and Pan. Yeah, quite a place. When Jesus brought his disciples into Caesarea, I'm sure they were wide-eyed as they looked around and saw all of the sin and wickedness. The worship to these gods wasn't probably a wickedly extraordinary thing to see. There was a very particular geological structure that sat just outside the city. It was a sheer cliff, and Philip, after whom the city was ultimately renamed, had come to this place. He had carved out into the side of this cliff, this mountain, little niches in which he put idols to the various gods. And he built 3 temples. He built one to Augustus Caesar because, you see, Augustus thought himself to be a god and needed to be worshipped. And so in honor of him and to keep his respect, there was a temple to Augustus. Then there was a temple to Zeus. Zeus, of course, was considered the god of the sky and the god of thunder. And then he built an altar to Pan. In fact, Pan was kind of the centerpiece. There was in this crazy geological structure a cave that dropped back into the mountain, and a stream from a freshwater spring flowed out of that cave and again made up one of the fountainheads, one of the beginning points of the Jordan River, and it flowed all the way down to Galilee and then beyond down closer even to Jerusalem. What a place. The god Pan was considered the god of fertility, the god, some said, of the underworld, the beginnings, if you would, almost like the womb of life. But don't confuse him with the god that was loving. He was a lover. I would think it better to think of him as a god of lust rather than a god of love. And the worship, the way they worship Pan, if you thought Aphrodite and the way they worshiped her was unusual or sensual or highly erotic, the worship of Pan was even worse. Pan was half goat and half man, and you can already begin to imagine how they envisioned worshiping a god like that. I won't go into the details, you can look it up yourself. But here's what I will say. The disciples were witness to some of the most unusual expressions of worship that you could imagine as they came into Caesarea. And as they looked at those cliffs and they saw the temples to Augustus and Caesar and Pan and Zeus, they were witnessing what happens when men are allowed to worship a god and create that god and then worship him in ways that they thought were fitting. It's totally opposed to everything that they had grown up with in Judaism, completely opposed to the temple worship they were used to back in Jerusalem even, and certainly in great opposition to what Jesus taught them. And what was he bringing them here for? Why this field trip to this place of wickedness? As they walk around the city and as they witness all that is happening, Jesus is, I think, giving them a great visual lesson about who he is, who they are, and who their enemy is, and what the battle is that will look like that they're going to be fighting. And so we'll begin reading in Matthew 16:13. When Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he began asking his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Well, some say John the Baptist, and others say Elijah. Others say perhaps Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And they said, that is Simon Peter, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Who do men say that I am? Who are we? As we're walking through this place of wickedness where men have created their own gods, who are we? Who am I as the Messiah? And who does that make you? The confession that Peter makes is, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. I would imagine he looked him square in the eye when he said that. With conviction, I know who you are. You are Messiah. His great confession is one that says to Jesus, I don't see you as these gods. And that's what Jesus is trying to show, the contrast between a god like Caesar, who is nothing more than a man on earth who decides he needs to be treated like a god, or Pan, who was a god that was in it all for himself. It was about lust. Or a god like Zeus, who supposedly controlled the heavens, the skies, and the thunder, and was able to was visibly seen, and yet at the same time really never could affect anything other than punishment when he brought about the horrific storms that might come, or thunder that would do damage to crops through the lightning and the hail that might fall. Not that kind of God. You need to visualize the nature of my kingdom, he's saying to them. I am the Christ. I am the Son of the living God. I am the one that is to be fighting the battle that is before us and to lead you into that war. But it's not the kind of war that you probably are anticipating. And look around. The mistake that the Jews are making is they're trying to fight me in the flesh. And the mistake these people are making is they're trying to worship these gods in and through the flesh completely. They've left something out that is crucially important. Let's keep reading. Jesus answered and said, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you that you're Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell, you see, will not prevail against it. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. The gates of hell. I forgot to tell you one thing. That geological formation that had the temple of Pan, the part of it where the temple to Pan was built, it was built right in front of the opening of the cave that dropped deep into that mountain. And it was believed by the pagans that this was the mouth of Hades. They called it the gates of hell. Men would go deep into that cavern and carry sacrifices, sometimes even their own children, and throw them off a cliff at the back of that cave into the rushing waters, the fresh water boiling up from within that mountain, and they would allow those sacrifices to roll their way out. Whenever I think of that horrific worship, I realize that they were thinking that they were worshiping the other world. They thought that they were paying tribute to the underworld. They were an acknowledgement of death and all that surrounded it. The gates of hell. That is who the enemy is. When Jesus carried them there, he's saying, you need to realize who we're fighting. We're not fighting against flesh and blood. And by the way, notice he says, flesh and blood isn't what revealed this to you, but rather you are convinced of who I am because of a revelation of the Spirit, a revelation in the Spirit. In the book of John, the first chapter, verse 42, Jesus changes the name of Cephas to Peter. He calls him by the name that would signify the rock. And the rock would be a faith in the foundation that was laid by Jesus Christ. People have for years wondered, what did he mean when he said, upon this rock I'll build my church? Was it on Peter's back or was it on Peter's confession? It was really on neither. It was on the truth that Jesus is the Christ. But make no mistake about it. Peter was given the keys to the kingdom, and he did open the gates into the heavenly kingdom that God established on earth through the death of Jesus Christ and through his resurrection. But it is on his faith, his belief, his conviction that he was active, that he engaged, that he went into battle, and he fought the battle against the right enemy, the enemy of death, the enemy of sin, the gates of hell. Look around you right now. You need to realize who we are. We are of the Christ, the Son of the living God. And our weapons of warfare are not weapons of the flesh. They aren't swords and sticks and bows and arrows and spears. Our battle is fought with the weapons of the sword of the Spirit. Our shield is the Word of God. And salvation rides as the helmet on our head, and our feet are shod with the good news of Jesus Christ. All of that imagery from Ephesians tells us that the battle we face is spiritual because we have a spiritual king, and we fight our battles in a spiritual realm. Caesarea Philippi was not to be feared by God's people. In fact, it was the stronghold into which they would go. You notice Jesus said, the gates of hell will not prevail against my kingdom that I'm establishing. The gate was the weakest part in a wall, and it was the place that was usually first attacked by an enemy or an opponent. Jesus is saying, we're going to go and we're going to fight this battle, and we're going to not be defensive, we're going to be offensive. We're going straight for the weak point, and we're going straight into battle, into that place. Going to Caesarea Philippi was no fearful thing for Jesus. The fearful thing for him, if there was any, was the fact that the battle was going to have to be fought with his own spiritual life. He was going to have to face the rulers in Jerusalem and suffer and be killed. Look around. Our battle that we fight today is not against flesh and blood. As Jesus walked through the city of Caesarea with the apostles, I'm sure he was pointing to all of those temples. And he was saying, our battle is against the mindset of men like Caesar, who would try to put himself in the position of God. That's our battle. Our battle is against the mindset that allows people to think they can create their own God, like the gods of Pan or Zeus, and figure out how they want to worship them in sensual and ungodly ways. And our battle is against that. Our battle is against spiritual forces. In fact, have you ever looked at Ephesians chapter 6? There's an interesting chapter in which he's talking about the great battle that is fought and how that this battle is one that we have to win, but it's a battle that most folks really struggle with because they try to fight the spiritual battle on an earthly plane. But you see, the battle we fight is with the strength and the might of the Lord, Ephesians 6 verse 10 says. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, verse 11 says, but against the rulers and the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. That's our battle. That's who we fight. That's the place where we win the victory. You see, flesh and blood cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven, but spirit can. And that's why we fight for the spirits of men, because that's what's of value to the Lord. Don't fear the one that can kill just the body. You fear the one that can kill both body and soul in hell. And so we fight at the gates of hell to burst forth and to win and to be victorious in that kingdom. Jesus would say in Revelation 1:18, I hold the keys to death and Hades. Some translations say death and hell. But I hold the keys to the underworld. I hold the keys to the place where the unrighteous will forever be placed in punishment. I am the one who holds those keys. He said that after his resurrection, not before his death and resurrection. But he says to Peter, I'll give you the keys to the kingdom. They're kind of the same keys, aren't they, in a way? The keys to the kingdom allow you into life, but the keys to the kingdom also release you from death. And so we come into this place of spiritual victory because we've fought a spiritual battle. We realize Satan is the prince of this world. And as they walked around Caesarea, they saw he was the prince of the world. And as Jesus said, this is our war. This is our battle. Their eyes must have just been wide with amazement as they thought that now it's beginning maybe to make a little sense, but they still didn't get it, did they? It wouldn't be until after his resurrection that they understood. There's an interesting verse in the book of John that says that the disciples really didn't get it. They didn't understand. When some of his original followers were with him, it says in John 12:34 that they said, well, the Messiah, according to the law, is supposed to last forever. How is it that you speak of death and going away? When Jesus begins to speak in Matthew 16, after these great statements about giving the keys to the kingdom to Peter and about the nature of their war and their battle and the confirmation of God not being flesh and blood, but rather by the Spirit, it says, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and he must suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. And that's when Peter takes him aside and says, may it never be, Lord. You see, Peter was thinking just like those disciples from John chapter 12, wasn't he? He was thinking the same thoughts. How is it that you can reign and live forever if you die? And Jesus is telling them, look, our battle is a different battle. It doesn't look like an earthly battle. I wonder if Peter had his sword at his side then. You remember when he gets to Gethsemane, he has it, and he's ready to go to war. He's thinking that this is when the kingdom is going to be won. And he thinks that it's going to take that sword to win it. Did he have it with him in Caesarea? Was he thinking still, I don't know when the war starts, but I'm going to be ready? Did it ever become a curiosity to him that Jesus didn't carry his sword? Did it ever amaze the apostles as they traveled together that when Jesus is speaking about his battle and his work and his mission, that Rome never came up? If it ever did, it was because someone else brought it up, like asking, why don't they pay, or should they pay taxes to Caesar? Well, that's not our war. That's not our battle. That's not what matters. How often do we get bogged down in battles that aren't our battle? We're not fighting a political battle. In the grand scheme of things, does it really matter whether we live in a country that is communist, socialist, capitalist, whatever-ist? In the grand scheme of things? That's not our battle. Our battle is not about flesh and blood. Our battle is not about whether or not to pay taxes to Caesar. Our battle is for the souls of men. When Peter pulls him aside and says, "May it never be, Lord. This may never happen to you." Verse 23, he looked at Peter and he said, "Get behind me, Satan." What a fantastic statement in the environment they were in. Jesus is introducing them to Satan's stronghold. He's right there at the gates of hell, and he says to Peter, when you say things like that, you are acting for Satan. My goodness, how often do we forget our battle and we begin to fight on Satan's side, even with the best of intentions, because we forget who we are, and we forget who our enemy is, and we forget where and how we are to fight the battle. This is the enemy, Peter. This is the enemy. The great thing in this case is that Jesus, after saying, "Get behind me, Satan," the conversation must have gotten deeper. Either that or Jesus must have looked at maybe one of those temples as he said it, so that Peter realized the statement that he had made was in conformity with the kinds of things those gods or their worshipers would have said, rather than the things a disciple of Jesus Christ would have said. And his ignorance in that moment, his inability to understand at that moment, was overlooked. And it's kind of like Philippians 3:15, where Paul said, all of these great things about the spiritual nature of the kingdom you should get by now. But if you don't, and I'm going to paraphrase the translation, God will reveal it to you in good time. Just wait. You'll see. And Peter would see soon. Friends, the things of God are just not on the same plane as the things of the world. Some things belong to God, and they're not quite yet ready for us to grasp. Our faith has to deepen. Our spirituality has to be enriched. We have to claim more of the Spirit in our lives and push more of the world out for these things to make sense. I don't understand a lot of things about the Bible. I don't understand the nature of salvation in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, we're part of a world, particularly in a fellowship that has its roots of its how it interprets and how it understands and how it tries to digest and ingest Scripture. We like to be able to fully understand everything. That's just not always possible. There are mysteries of the gospel that are hidden, and some things belong to God, like Him choosing you. I don't know how He chooses us exactly. I do know that 1 Corinthians chapter 2 says that unless God touches our hearts, we're not able to see the things of the Spirit of God. Why is that? And how does He do that? And you'll surely find someone who'll give you the explanation. But I would safely venture to say they're not going to be right, at least not 100% right. Some things belong to God. The Spirit moves and works because the battle we fight is a spiritual battle. We have a spiritual power who assists us in fighting it. And because the grip of Satan in this world is so strong, the grip of the Spirit grabbing hold of our hearts needs to be equally strong so that there can be balance. Verses 24, he keeps going. Jesus said to the disciples, look, after he just said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," you're not thinking about the interest of God. You're setting your mind on the interest of men. Jesus then says to the disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Cross. The Jews knew what that meant. They had seen people crucified before. Do you wonder when it says that Jesus began to tell his disciples, whoever wishes to take up his life would lose it, and whoever wishes to lose his life for my sake will find it? What will you be profited if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul? What will you give in exchange for your soul? All of this language, when he's telling them, I'm going to die. I've got to go to Jerusalem, suffer and die, verse 21. And then he says in verse 24, if you want to come after me, take up your cross. Do you suppose that the cross came up in his explanation of how he would die himself? It doesn't say that it does. But it makes me wonder. And even if it didn't come up in discussion about his particular personal real death, I would imagine that the fact that he chose the cross as the emblem of the type of sacrifice they would have to give, they must have realized he was speaking about a magnanimous sacrifice, a total sacrifice, a suffering sacrifice, the kind of high price And what's he saying to them? Look, the battle we're going to fight is not flesh, it's spirit. It's a battle of heaven versus hell. It's a battle of the eternal versus the temporal. It's a battle about getting beyond the veil of death. Death to yourself on earth, Galatians 2:20. I've been crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. But also a battle in which we're trying to carry souls and snatch them out of the grip of Satan in the fleshly world and open their eyes to the spiritual truths that are around them. The gates of hell. By the time chapter 17 comes about, he's traveled up the mountain. Some people believe that the mountain he traveled, that they traversed, was the one further south, that it would have been closer to Jerusalem. But to me, it makes perfect sense that he just kept right on walking north. Because Mount Hermon was the mountain that was the highest in all of Israel. And I can just see them climbing that mountain. And as they get to the top, they see Moses and Elijah and Jesus transfigured in front of them. This would have been the statement of who Jesus was, the statement about the nature of the battle, the statement about the spiritual aspects of the kingdom. You see, it would already happen that Peter had said, "You are the Christ." Man had confessed in the flesh who Jesus was. Now God's going to confess. As they ask, can we build one temple or tabernacle rather, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah? One for Augusta, one for Zeus, and one for Pan, one for Elijah, one for... What does the voice from the heavens say? This is my beloved Son, hear ye him. Who gives that confirmation? God himself. And at that moment, which had to have been one of the most memorable for the disciples. In fact, I know it was. Have you ever looked at 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18? We don't come to you with cleverly devised tales to make known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We were eyewitnesses of who he is, of his majesty. When he received honor and glory from God, the confirmation from the Father, the utterance that was made saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased," we ourselves heard this utterance from the heavens when we were with him on the holy mountain, the place where the presence of God descended and confirmed who they were, who Jesus was, what the battle was to be, what the truth was of the enemy. We've got so much at our disposal in the Spirit that we don't claim. It's time for us to lift our eyes to the heavens and hear the voice of God say, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." My prayer is that you will come into his presence, that you will realize the spiritual powers that are available to you, and you will fight, not against flesh and blood, not the wrong battles, but that you'll go to war for the souls of men, because our leader, the Lord Jesus Christ, has in his Spirit carried us to the gates of hell, and he said to us, "Go and be victorious." It's time we do that.